Today we're going to be looking at soil health in the paddock and things that landowners can do themselves with commonly available equipment. My name's Rebecca Tonkin. This program's brought to you by the Hills and Fleurieu Landscape Board and the Australian Government's National Landcare Program. We'd like to thank the landowner for letting us use his paddock today. We're located in the southern Fleurieu, about in the middle, in a hilly area, gently rolling hills behind us coming down to a river valley. The area is far enough from the coast that it's not really affected by much other than a nice cool sea breeze every now and then. But the soil itself, as we'll see soon, is a nice loamy sand, which is kind of typical of much of the southern Fleurieu. And as we look across this area, we can see patches of different colour in the paddock. There's greener bits where there's some kikuyu growing and some fog grass. The reddish patches are where there's sorrel growing. In amongst this, it has been, as you can see, cut for hay recently, but there's also been ryegrass, cocksfoot and phalaris as the pasture species, and a few clovers mixed in. Part of what we're looking at in regards to the soil health is the presence of indicator species. So these are species that grow in certain conditions and that indicate to us that there might be something going on in the soil. For instance, this reddish stuff, this is the flowering sorrel. Sorrel is a plant that is very tolerant of acid conditions. So when we see a lot of sorrel around, then we say this soil should be tested for acidity. Now Yorkshire fog, which is the tufty grass just here, that is also very tolerant of acid conditions, and so that's another indicator that there may be acidity in this soil. So here we've got some tools that you can use to collect soil samples. Now this one you may not be able to find off the shelf, but you can order them online, and you may also be able to borrow it from your local landscape board's office. There's different forms, but it's a soil sampler, gets pushed into the ground, turn it, and you can then take out a small sample and put it in a bucket. And you do this 30 or 40 times and you've got enough to send off to the laboratory. And you would do this by walking across your whole paddock or your whole area of soil that you're interested in. Then you've got your post hole digger or auger, quite easy to use. Just place and turn. Slow, but you can get to a reasonable depth with that as long as you've got reasonably soft soil. And finally, everyone should have one of these. Good spade, flat across the end because we want to get an even depth and strong enough to do what we want. Also useful, a little bit of tarp or plastic just to put your soil sample on as it comes out, and a bucket to put your samples in as you collect them. Okay, so using a soil sampler, you would pick your spot in the paddock that's typical of the whole thing. So I'm going to go from here straight across, and I push it into the ground to the right depth, take my sample, shake it in the bucket, and I'm going to go across and do this about 40 times to collect 500 grams of soil. If you're doing this on a heavier soil type, you might need to take a screwdriver or a little bit of metal or rod to scrape the soil out of the sampler if it's a bit harder. 37. Notice I'm zigzagging a little bit so that I'm not just walking along one row. 40. And while I'm doing it, I notice how hard or how soft the ground is as I push the sampler in, what plants there are around the place, and whether those plants, whether they be crop or pasture or weed species, what those can tell me about the soil. For our samples, we can pick out any bits of large roots. If there were any stones in there, we would be able to take those out, but small stuff can stay there because anything that's larger than about 2 millimeters gets sieved out. Yeah, and this is quite nice. There's still a little bit of moisture left in this soil, even though it's drying out. Okay, so I've got my soil sample in my bucket. I'll just stir it around a little bit so it's well mixed. I'll take out the roots and stuff that that's not going to get analysed, so that just gets thrown out. Any large stones can also go, they're not needed. And we then put that in a labelled sandwich bag. Very important to label it so that later on you know where it came from and the lab knows who it belongs to. So there we go. That's a imaginary landowner paddock labelled with the paddock and also the depth if you're doing more than one depth. So in this case we've taken the top 10 centimetres. Then we half fill our bag, which is about 500 grams, because that's how much the lab needs for usual testing. So here's our bag. Squeeze the air out of it and seal it. And then, if you're sending it by post, you want to be extra safe. So put it inside another bag so that it's double bagged, because you really don't want your sample bag breaking open and then you get your samples mixed up with something else or lost. So double bagged 500 grams of soil sample ready to send away. So if you don't have access to a soil sampler, or you might want to be taking a larger number of soil samples or deeper soil samples, then what you've usually got available is a spade or an auger or post hole digger. They both work pretty much the same way, so I'll demonstrate with the spade. So here we have our spade. Dig down to the depth that you want. Here's where your ruler comes in handy, because if you're sampling for a 10 centimetre depth for a specific reason, like nutrient sampling, you do need it to be 10 centimetres deep. The soil right at the surface of the soil is more fertile than what's underneath, so in order for you to know what's along the whole of the 10 centimetres, you need nice even sample 10 centimetres deep all the way down. Okay, so we've got our 10 centimetre deep and we've got a nice smooth face there that's not contaminated with anything. Now I scrape back a little bit if there's too much on the surface, because you don't want to pick up, you know, too much stubble or chaff or whatever. Then nice straight down, get yourself a nice even slice of soil all the way along that's pretty even all the way down, and pop it in your bucket. And you would want to do that 10 to 20 times across the area that you're sampling, depending on the size of it. You'll get more soil than you need, but you need to get a nice representative sample, because if you only take one or two on the area that, say, had a bit of flooding, or that the animals have been camping on at night, that won't be typical of the area. You want to select the spots that are as normal as possible across the paddock. If you want to sample deeper, or you're just curious about what's underneath the surface in your soil, then this is probably going to be the easiest way to go. So take your samples. I lay them out on a bit of tarp so that I can see them in the order that they come out in. So my auger goes down about 5 centimetres for every bite, so I know that every time I put a sample down, that's 5 centimetres deep. I clean out the hole in between. This soil is quite good. It's not collapsing in as I take the auger out. Just something to be aware of though if you've got a very loose soil. And just as I say it, we come to the looser sand and I've got to take it out by hand. There we go. So you can probably see as we're coming down, we're starting to get slightly lighter sand. This at the top reasonably dark because of organic matter. Now that we're down around 20 centimetres, it's getting a little bit paler. You will get colour changes due to moisture changes as well, but you can feel the moisture in the soil as you bring it out. Getting a little bit rocky down the bottom of the hole. You can feel the gravel starting to bite on the auger. At the moment I'm down 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50 centimetres, which is about the length of my arm, so I'm probably going to have to stop there. Here we've got the soil as it came out, starting at the top, going down, and that's the very bottom just in front. So our topsoil slightly grey because of organic matter, going down to a lighter sand subsoil. How do you know it's sand? Well, we're going to do a texture test. So I've got a little bottle of water here. It's either rainwater, clean rainwater, or distilled water. You want it to be nice and clean so that it doesn't have any salt or anything in it. And to do the texture test, we take a little handful from wherever we want to know the texture, squeeze a little bit of water into it, and gently work that moisture in. With a sandy soil like this, if it's very dry, it can be a little bit water repellent and take a little while for the water to work in, but it will do it. So we squeeze it together until it's nicely moist all the way through. Then try and roll it into a ball like that. If it breaks up like that, then it's sand. Sand just won't hold together at all. We double check that by squeezing it together and try to make it into a ribbon. And as you can see, it doesn't hold together very long. It's got just enough organic matter into it to cling a little bit, so we'd say that's a loamy sand. It's got a nice little bit of bounce in it as I squeeze this ball. It's not just a solid lump. I can feel some of the organic matter in it. And if you hold it up and listen to it, you can hear the sand grains crunching against each other and grinding. So that's the loamy sand at the surface. If we go a little bit further down and see what's underneath in this pale section, so we'll take that. We've got a little bit of a root there, we don't need that, that's not part of the soil. Add the water. Squeeze it together. Add a little bit more water if you need to. And again, this one's really quite crunchy. It doesn't have the bounce in it that the topsoil does because there's less organic matter. There's hardly any organic matter apart from a few old roots down deep. If we try and roll it, it's just falling apart in my hand. So again, this one's a sand, and if we try and ribbon it, it's even less than the surface. So it's definitely a real sand, like beach sand down there. So dust off your hands or rinse them off in between, because if you've got clay on your hands, then it gets mixed up with sand and you might think you've got a clayey sand instead of just sand. So down the bottom, I'm going to see what some of these clumps are. So they look a bit more brown, they're a bit harder. So are they sand with something sticking them together, or are they in fact a bit of clay? In this case, I reckon we're going to probably find that they're sand that's been stuck together and made a little sandstony kind of object. Yep, that's a little sandstone rock. That's a little sandstone rock. But sometimes deep down you can find clay. I'm using a saucer for this part because I don't want to contaminate any of these with any of the chemicals that I might be using for these tests. So I'm going to take a little sample from each of the layers that I'm interested in. So topsoil, just below the topsoil, about 20 centimetres, 30, that's a little rock, and then down the bottom. So top down to the bottom. And I'm going to do a pH test on it. So here's my pH solution. Just make a little hollow so that it doesn't run straight off. And I add some drops. They're soaking in, that's good. Oop, there we go. Adding some more drops. And then we add the powder, which helps us to see the colour correctly. And the colour develops quite quickly. You don't want to leave it any longer than a minute or even half a minute in hot weather, because as it dries out it gets lighter. So we compare that with the colour card that comes with the kit. It's important to use a colour card that comes with the kit because different companies have slightly different colours in their different formulas. So when we have a look at this, we can see that the top is about 6. So 6, this would be the equivalent of pH in water when you're using a field kit. Then as we go to the subsoil, which is just underneath, so this is 5 to 10 centimetres, you can see that's very, very yellow-green. So that's 4.5 to 5 in the subsoil. Now, if that was pH calcium chloride, that would be giving a pH of about 4. So here we are a little bit further down. We're still around that 5 mark, still 5 to 4.5. So we can see that this site has got quite an acidic subsoil. Because it's a sand, there's probably not a lot of aluminium to release. Acid conditions in soil will release aluminium from clay. But it still means that the plants were right that we saw growing here that are acid tolerant, because this is indeed quite an acid soil. So we've done our pH. Now, because this soil is so acid, it's highly unlikely to have any carbonates in it. If we had a more alkaline soil, where the pH was around the 8s and 9s, then we would use a dilute solution of hydrochloric acid to test whether there's carbonates in there. And if you drop some acid onto carbonates, then it reacts and it fizzes and bubbles. But unfortunately, we won't be able to see that here. So the last test that we can do in the paddock, we use either a saucer or, in this case, a nice glass jar, nice and clean, no detergent left in it or anything. And we can take a crumb of soil. This is sandy soil, so it doesn't have many crumbs, but we'll take one just to demonstrate. And we very carefully place it in that water. Now, if it's got good structure, then that will hold together and just sit there as a crumb, and it doesn't go cloudy at all. If it's got poor structure, then it can collapse and slake. And if it's dispersive, then you'll start to see a milky ring form around it as the clay in the soil starts to disperse into the water. And in this case, it's just sitting there. There's a little bit of sand moving because it's a sandy soil and that sand doesn't hold together very well anyway. But for what it is, it's doing quite well. Overall, now that we've had a look at the pasture and the health of it and the soil especially, so we've got quite a nice topsoil with a reasonable amount of organic matter. It's a loamy sand at the surface going down to a sand underneath, and although it's holding together quite well, the biggest thing that we've found is the pH is quite acid. Not so much in the surface, which is where you might be testing normally, but just underneath it in the root zone, we've got a very acid soil, which is probably constraining production. So in order to treat that, we would need to add something that neutralises the acid, such as lime or dolomitic lime. That will add carbonate, which neutralises acid, and it would also add calcium and possibly magnesium to the soil, which are nutrients for both the pasture and for stock.